No one talks about Blackwood Library without lowering their voice first, because even saying its name feels like an invitation to something that has been listening for more than a century. Hidden in a quiet corner of Massachusetts, the library looks harmless during the day. Red brick walls, tall windows, rows of ancient books. But locals know that once the clock strikes midnight, the building stops being a library and becomes something else entirely. Blackwood Library was built in 1892, and its first librarian, Elias Blackwood, was not just a caretaker of books, but a man consumed by them, a man who believed knowledge was alive, and that books were not meant to be read casually but obeyed, respected, and feared. Elias was known for staying alone in the library long after sunset, refusing help, refusing company, wandering the aisles with a lantern long after the doors were locked, whispering to the shelves as if the books could hear him. What most people didn't know was that Elias had a private obsession. Forbidden texts, books that had been banned, burned, or buried because they were believed to contain truths humans were never meant to know. Over the years, Elias secretly collected these volumes and hid them in a sealed basement beneath the library, a place not marked on any official blueprint. Among those books was one that even other collectors refused to touch, a leather-bound volume with no author's name, known only as the Book of Whispering Souls. According to legend, the book could open a door between the living and the dead, allowing its reader to hear voices from beyond. But the price was always the same. Once the final page was read, the reader would never truly leave the book behind. On a freezing winter night in 1899, Elias made the choice that sealed his fate. He locked the library doors, descended into the basement alone, lit his lantern, and placed the book on a wooden table, ignoring every warning ever written about it. As he began to read aloud, the air in the basement grew thick and cold. The lantern flickered violently, and faint whispers began to rise from the walls themselves, growing louder with each page until they sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once, all repeating his name. When Elias reached the final page and spoke the last sentence, the whispers turned into screams. The shelves above shook violently. Books crashed to the floor, and shadows detached themselves from the walls, stretching and crawling like living things. No one heard Elias scream, but the terror etched into his face the next morning told the story clearly enough. When staff arrived at dawn, they found Elias lying on the cold stone floor of the basement, eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-gasp, his body completely uninjured yet twisted in pure horror. Doctors later confirmed something that made the case even more disturbing. Elias Blackwood did not die of disease, poison, or violence. His heart had simply stopped, overwhelmed by fear so intense his body could not survive it. But the most terrifying discovery was what wasn't found. The Book of Whispering Souls had vanished. No signs of theft, no broken locks, no footprints. Just an empty space on the table where the book had been, as if it had never existed at all. The basement was sealed immediately. The death ruled an unexplained tragedy, and the town tried desperately to move on. But from that night forward, Blackwood Library was no longer a place of learning. It was a place of waiting. People began reporting strange sounds after closing time, books falling without being touched, pages turning slowly in empty rooms, and a faint, commanding voice echoing through the aisles, whispering, "Silence! This is my library." Some swore they saw a figure moving between the shelves after midnight, an old man carrying a lantern, his posture rigid, his movements slow and deliberate, as if still performing his duties. Others claimed that certain books felt warm when touched, as if something inside them was breathing. The town eventually stopped asking questions, because every attempt to investigate ended the same way, with fear, denial, and silence. What no one wanted to admit was the truth slowly taking shape in the darkness. Elias Blackwood never left the library when he died. Whatever answered him that night did not take his life alone. It took his place, binding his soul to the books he loved, turning him into something far worse than a ghost, a guardian cursed to protect forbidden knowledge, and search endlessly for the next reader willing to open the wrong book at the wrong time. After Elias Blackwood's death, Blackwood Library ceased to be merely a place of study and quiet contemplation. It became a living, breathing entity of its own, a repository not just of books, but fear, anger, and something ancient that no one could name. Locals began to notice changes almost immediately. Lights that had always burned steadily would flicker violently at the stroke of midnight. Shadows that belonged to shelves and pillars seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending at angles that defied logic. as if they were watching, waiting. On particularly cold nights, people passing by reported hearing the faint sound of footsteps on the upper floors long after the doors had been locked, echoing through the empty streets. Slow and deliberate, never breaking rhythm, never pausing, a haunting percussion that seemed to chase anyone foolish enough to linger. Security personnel who dared to patrol the library at night often left in a panic, describing the sensation of being observed from every corner simultaneously, of whispers brushing their ears, voices that were both familiar and terrifyingly alien murmuring, "Silence! This is my library," over and over, as though testing them, measuring them, judging whether they were worthy to remain or to disappear. The most courageous, or perhaps the most foolish, ventured inside, only to report experiences that were impossible to rationalize. Books falling from shelves without a trace of wind or human interference, pages turning on their own even in locked rooms, chairs sliding across floors, and the unmistakable sense of eyes following them no matter where they moved. A few claimed to have glimpsed the figure of Elias himself, standing silently between the shelves with a lantern, his face pale and frozen, eyes black as tar, moving soundlessly, never blinking, never speaking, yet somehow communicating a deep, ancient warning that the library was no longer a place of man, but of something far older, something that Elias had willingly or unwillingly become a part of. Attempts to investigate were futile. Electronic devices failed within the walls, cameras malfunctioned, flashlights flickered and died, and even the most seasoned paranormal investigators left muttering about a presence that was aware of them, something intelligent, patient, and absolutely relentless. In hushed tones, it was said that if a visitor lingered too long, they could feel an oppressive weight pressing on their chest, a cold breath on the back of their neck, and the sensation that something was crawling along the walls just out of sight, circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Those who dared enter the forbidden basement reported that the air there had a peculiar, almost metallic taste, thick with dust and something darker, a smell like old paper mixed with decay, and the faint, unshakable sound of whispers rising from every shadow, echoing in languages that no one alive had ever spoken, calling names, promising knowledge, offering power, but always at a cost. Students from nearby universities began daring one another to spend the night, but very few lasted more than an hour before fleeing, pale, trembling, often silent for days afterward, their dreams haunted by dark shelves stretching into infinity, by books opening themselves and staring at them with blank, accusing pages, by the same black-eyed figure silently watching from every corner. Even during the day, something lingered, a chill that had no source, a sudden oppressive weight, the feeling that unseen eyes were tracking every movement, every breath, every thought. And if someone accidentally opened one of the forbidden books, even for a moment, they would sometimes report hearing the faintest whisper of their own name, as if the library had recognized them, as if it had marked them. Over time, legends grew that Elias Blackwood's spirit had merged with the library, no longer human, no longer living, existing only as a sentience embedded in the shelves, the books, the dust and the walls, feeding on the fear of anyone who dared approach. Parents warned their children. Students avoided it after sunset, and even the bravest historians hesitated to enter, yet the library seemed almost a call to those who were drawn to forbidden knowledge, promising secrets beyond imagination, secrets worth any risk. And the risk was never fully explained, only felt. People swore they had seen books rearranging themselves overnight, forming patterns too precise to be accidental. And at times, pages would seem to shift, words appearing where none had been before, as if the library itself were trying to communicate, or perhaps trap those who dared to read. Some visitors claimed that in the dead of night, they had glimpsed figures moving inside the shadows, hundreds of tiny silhouettes flickering like ghosts among the stacks, all silently watching, all waiting. And if you were unlucky enough to meet the gaze of the black-eyed figure of Elias, time itself seemed to bend. Minutes would stretch into hours, and no matter how you moved, you could not leave. More terrified with reports of missing people. Those who entered the library alone at night, never to emerge again, their disappearance leaving only a faint coldness behind, as though the space they had occupied had been swallowed. Few dared to piece together the story, that Elias, in his obsession with forbidden knowledge, had bound himself to the library, and now the building itself had become a predator, patient, intelligent, eternal, seeking out new minds to feed its hunger, whispering promises, teasing curiosity, waiting for the moment someone would let their guard down. And so, over decades, the library became something of a myth, a story to scare teenagers, a cautionary tale. But for those who had seen it at night, for those who had felt the cold brush of unseen fingers on their shoulders, for those who had heard the whispers and seen the shadows move, it was no story at all. Blackwood Library was alive, it was awake, and it had remembered every footstep, every name, every secret it had ever absorbed. It waited patiently, ceaselessly, for the next visitor who was curious enough to linger, desperate enough to enter, and foolish enough to think that knowledge could ever be free of consequence. And those who survived, even those who fled screaming into the night, never truly escaped. They would carry the memory with them, the weight of eyes that never blinked, the whispers that followed them long after they left, the cold pressure on their chest, the feeling that somewhere in the shadows of every library, in every stack of books, in every quiet corner, Elias Blackwood was still watching, still waiting, still guarding, still whispering, and that if they returned, even for a moment, the library would remember and it would not forgive. Years after the horrifying events surrounding Elias Blackwood, the stories of Blackwood Library have become the sort of legends whispered among university students, tales dismissed as overblown rumors or ghost stories until brave or foolish decided to test their courage. And it was one such student, named Daniel, who would become the latest in a long line of those drawn into its darkness. Daniel was an ambitious history student, skeptical of the paranormal, someone who prided himself on logic and reason, laughing at the stories of vanished visitors and black-eyed shadows, confident that he would emerge unscathed even if he stayed inside the library after closing hours for his research. But as he stepped across the worn threshold that late winter evening, he immediately felt a chill, not just the cold air of the stone corridors, but something heavier, like the weight of invisible eyes, watching, calculating, waiting. The lights inside flickered softly as he moved between the towering shelves, the silence so complete that every creak of his boots sounded like a cannon, every breath loud in the oppressive quiet, and Daniel tried to dismiss it as imagination, focusing instead on the purpose of his visit, locating documents in the late 1800s that referenced Elias Blackwood's collection, unaware that he was wandering closer to the heart of the library's curse with every step. As midnight approached, the air thickened. It became harder to breathe, and a faint whisper, almost imperceptible at first, began to curl around the edges of his consciousness, repeating words he could not quite understand. But slowly those words began to form a sentence that made his blood run cold. "Daniel, you should not be here," he froze, the lantern he carried trembling slightly in his hand. Shadows along the shelves stretching unnaturally, as though the walls themselves were bending toward him. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from behind, circling, never approaching directly, always maintaining an impossible distance. And he realized with growing terror that he was not alone. Ignoring the warnings his rational mind tried to impose, he descended into the forbidden basement, following a faint, almost magnetic pull toward a dusty table where a single leather-bound book lay, eerily illuminated by an unseen light, its surface worn, cracked, and unmistakably the same book everyone had whispered about for over a century, the Book of Whispering Souls. Hesitation gripped him, but curiosity outweighed fear, and as he opened the cover, the air seemed to shiver, the walls groaning softly, the shadows shifting like dark water. The first page was blank, yet words began to appear as if written by an invisible hand, curling across the paper in letters of smoke. Elias was alone. Now so are you. The temperature dropped drastically, his breath visible in the lantern light, and the whispers multiplied into hundreds of overlapping voices, some shrill, some deep, all calling, demanding, each syllable slicing into his mind, clawing at his thoughts, promising knowledge and power but threatening something far worse in exchange. Daniel tried to close the book, but his hands felt heavy, paralyzed, as though something was holding them in place, and the shadows in the corners of the room thickened, pooling, coalescing into forms that resembled the long-dead librarian, black-eyed and motionless, silently observing, as if waiting for him to commit the final act that would seal his fate. He heard the soft dragging of chairs behind him, the flutter of pages turning without wind, and then the voice, low and resonant, speaking directly into his mind. Every reader becomes the next keeper, Panic surged, adrenaline and terror coiling tight his chest, but escape was impossible. When he turned to run, the basement seemed to stretch infinitely, hallways elongating and folding back on themselves, bookshelves rising impossibly high, blocking the exits, the lantern flickering and casting shadows that were no longer shadows, but hands reaching, grasping, bending toward him. Desperation clawed at him as he tried to flee, but the floor beneath him seemed to pulse with strange life, each step slowing, dragging, as though the library itself refused to let him leave. Then the whispers began to form sentences, naming him, recounting details of his life he had never shared, secrets he had hidden even from himself, and the realization hit him. The library did not just want to trap him physically. It wanted to absorb him completely, to merge his consciousness with its own, adding another soul to its endless collection, just as it had with Elias Blackwood over a century ago. Daniel screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence, his lantern rolling from his hands, extinguishing with a soft hiss, and the darkness became complete, yet he could still see, or at least feel, shapes moving around him, coiling closer, whispering, murmuring promises and threats in a cadence that unmade his sense of time and space. Then he felt it, a cold weight settling across his shoulders, a hand, invisible yet undeniable, pressing him down, forcing him to the ground, and the book opened itself fully, pages flapping wildly as if alive, writing his name across the center in a script that burned into his mind. Daniel, the next reader, the next keeper, his vision blurred, his body frozen, and in that instant he understood. There was no escape, no rescue, no breaking the curse, only submission to the library's will. When the sun rose the next morning, the doors of Blackwood Library opened, and Daniel was gone, leaving only a faint chill lingering in the air and a new book on the table, perfectly aligned, titled The Last Reader, Daniel. And so the pattern continued. The library, patient and eternal, waited silently for the next curious mind, the next intruder, the next victim, whispering from the shadows, rearranging its shelves, turning its pages, knowing every secret, watching every movement, ensuring that anyone who dared to linger too long, who dared to pry into forbidden knowledge, would vanish just as Elias had, just as Daniel had, their names added to an invisible ledger, their fears absorbed into the walls there, essence trapped forever. And if you ever find yourself wandering alone among ancient shelves, if you ever hear pages turning with no wind, if you ever feel the weight of unseen eyes on your back, remember this. Blackwood Library is alive. It remembers you, and it is waiting patiently for the moment you make the mistake of opening a book you were never meant to touch, because once you do, you will never leave, not truly, and the whispers will begin to call your name.